Good morning, America. How are ya? Monday Morning Rail. I'm your native son. I'm the city of New Orleans. Hi, I'm Denny Jelsma, and I'm at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida, where the sun always shines and running trains is a pleasure. Today is Monday, and you know what we do on Monday? You guessed it, we do show and tell. And show and tell starts right now.
Well, thank you, Denny, and good morning. Many of you have started your railroad enthusiasm with a Christmas tree and train around it. I was no exception to that. My family encouraged me, and that is where my story begins. I was very fortunate that I had a big family. My grandparents were with me until I was a young adult. I had all four of them, and three were born in 1888, the youngest born in 1894. And back in those days, there wasn't a lot of television, and people knew how to communicate. And where many people learn their history from books, it was always great to hear it firsthand. When you heard how people lived and developed their skills, it was way more interesting than reading statistics in a book. And people knew how to communicate, and good communication was when someone would talk to you and had the ability to put you right where they were. And I grew up with that type of an environment. Again, being born in 1888, my grandfather once said, I lived the best life. When I came to the United States, locomotives were burning wood, and I got to see man land on the moon. When you see that kind of a transition in life, what else can be said? My father's father was born in England, and in 1912 he came to the United States. His ambition was to come over on the Titanic, but fortunately he came over a couple months early. When he was a boy in school, they went year-round, and at 14 he went into an apprenticeship. He was an apprenticeship building wooden rail cars with canvas roofs. After that, he went into the Royal Navy and then came to the United States and put himself through school in Philadelphia. He went to work for Gulf Oil Corporation as an engineer and traveled all over building and troubleshooting factories, power plants, and even ship boilers. So he did a lot of traveling, and my father and grandmother did a lot of traveling to meet him. So my dad got a lot of train trips in. So in 1921, my grandfather and his brother, which lived in Jacksonville, was a master machinist for the Atlantic Coastline, along with his two sons, patented a ring-free piston. And after complications with the Atlantic Coastline claiming that he was an employee, he ended up getting the Florida East Coast to experiment with the piston, and we have pictures of the piston being installed in a Florida East Coast mountain in Miller Shop. After that, he also had something to do with the original car body filters in the EMC A units. But anyway, he retired in 49 and moved to Jacksonville to be close to his brother. So he spent the rest of his career traveling around the world on ships, and he also did train trips. And as a fun note, a lot of you have heard the story about the Atlantic Coastline R1 Northern. Well, when Baldwin delivered the engine to the Atlantic Coastline, my grandfather and his brother went to see the engine, and upon arriving, my grandfather put his hands on his hips and looked at it, and he told his brother, "They'll never balance this damn thing." Well, it happens that one of the top people of Baldwin Locomotive was standing there, and they abruptly left to keep from having confrontation. And the ironic thing to me is I've always heard so many different stories on that engine, and the supposedly success of it. Well, when Coastline got the engine, they tried running at 100 miles an hour, and it tore up the track so bad they ended up putting cameras on it to see what the story was. Well, they got footage of the locomotive actually leaving the rail and pounding it so bad that Baldwin had to try and rebalance the engine. Well, the story goes that they were successful in rebalancing it, but as I was told, they were somewhat successful. They ended up slowing the engine down, and eventually it went into freight service. So the success story of the R1 for me was not all that. And also, since then, I have seen many of things written about that locomotive really being one of the ends to the modern day super steam power, because the diesel had proven itself and the super steam engines just weren't what they were supposed to be. So, like I say, it was interesting, and that's a story for another day. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in a farm in Tifton, Georgia, and he did not want to be a farmer, so he and his young family hitched a wagon and moved to Florida around 1904. He had various jobs in the state between Jacksonville and New Smyrna, and at one point he was a motorman for the Jacksonville Trolley Company, and he ran a steam derrick for the Florida East Coast, and one of his jobs was helping rebuild the 1888 single-track swing bridge on the St. John's to making it the current double-track drawbridge that it is now. After that, he went to the Municipal Docks Railroad in Talleyrand and ran a 060 up until World War II. And my mother used to talk about on the weekends, he'd get a special move and he'd take her with him, and he'd put her on the seat box and just tell her not to touch anything. Well, those were some fond memories for my mother, and he would talk about when the war broke out, how we were hauling scrap out to be shot back to us. But anyway, he had to give up running that engine because the demand during the war was running at night and his eyesight was poor. So after that, he went to work in my grandmother's sundries, where he went to Mr. Setzer and learned how to be a butcher, along with Mr. Davis of Winn-Dixie. So that's what my grandfather did until he retired. And he was a man of few words, so I didn't learn a whole lot from him. It was verified by my father, and my grandfather would just agree with him. My father was born in Pennsylvania in 1928. He was raised in Pittsburgh, and he loved riding the trolley system, and he was around the railroad quite a bit. He never did work for the railroad, but he was very influential in teaching me because of his interest. And his brother as well was interested in the railroad. He lived in Charlotte and came down here several times a year, so that gave us an opportunity to go down to Jacksonville Terminal to pick him up. So again, I was in and out of Jacksonville Terminal quite a bit. My father was really good at teaching, and whenever we went to look at trains, it wasn't simply just looking at him. He would tell me what I was looking at, and that always led to wanting to know more. So that was a big inspiration for me to be around the railroad. So, like I say, his brother would come in. We would go out, and he would point out specific things. And two of the most impressive things that I can remember was he showed me the difference in the E units with the sloped nose, and then he showed me told me to listen to the sound of a Baldwin locomotive versus an EMD. But the best thing I can remember, or the earliest thing I can remember, was crossing Longwood Road, which was now University Boulevard. My father pulled over and he said, "Look at that, you'll probably never see another one," as a steam engine passed by. And in later years I discovered that Florida East Coast still ran steam engines up until 1958 during the perishable season. So I'm quite sure that was an 080 that I got to see run. I was born in Jacksonville in 1955, and aside of my childhood playing with trains at Christmas and what have you, when I got old enough, I would ride my bicycle or ride a city bus down to the Jacksonville terminal where I'd spend the day watching trains. So I was around a lot of railroad men, both family and the railroads themselves, and I got to know them and hear a lot of their stories, and really grew to appreciate their lifestyle and what they did. So, of course, when I turned 18, my ambition was to work with the railroad. So I was constantly applying down at the Seaboard Coastline building, and I ended up in Atlanta and putting in my applications with the ANWP and the Southern. Well, I ended up coming back to Jacksonville, and the guy that I was talking to at the Purple Palace said, "You want to work for the railroad so bad, you go to the Florida East Coast and get some experience and come back." Well, I didn't want to do that, but I did. I went to the Florida East Coast and they hired me that very day. Back in those days, the Florida East Coast was hiring 10 people every 6 weeks. And the railroad was still on strike, but it was not a visible strike. The only place they had a picket line was still in New Smyrna Beach. So the FEC would hire somebody, train them for 6 weeks, and at the end of 6 weeks, out of those 10 people, maybe 2 would mark up. At the end of 6 months, they might have 1 person left. The pay, the hours, and the way you were treated, people just wouldn't tolerate it. So the only thing that they had going for them was it didn't take a lot of seniority to hold a job with a day off and regular hours. But I hung in there, and I enjoyed working with the first generation locomotives and the equipment that we had. And looking back on it, it was a real blessing because I worked for the railroad within a 7-mile range of where I was born. So my entire life I've lived within 7 miles. So there's very few people that could say that. So I worked for the FEC in road and yard service for 44 years. Didn't like the road because you were always away from home. Back then it was a 6-day-a-week job, and all their trains ran at night, and I had a terrible time staying awake. So after a scare of falling asleep one time, I said, this is not for me. So I pretty much spent my entire career working out of Bowden Yard, and I really enjoyed transfer runs. When I hired out, the terminal was still open, but shortly thereafter closed. When my father passed in 2006, I started the Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum. I went into a slump, and my wife says, "You need to do something." So I decided to honor my father, my parents, and all those great railroad men that I've known by creating this organization. and trying to expand on what they told me and how it was. It's, to me, when you hear it from the people that lived it versus a book, it's much more meaningful. And I wish that I could reach more people to tell their stories, because it truly was the greatest generation, and it truly was the good old days. So we look forward to having some of you come, and we look forward to telling these stories. So thank you, Denny, and talk to you later.
Well, thank you, Rodney. That was very interesting. And now you know why the Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum is world famous. You know, it is an absolute joy to come and run trains here and sit and listen to guys like Rodney Butcher. We get to hear 44 years of railroad stories, from the guy that started the first day to somebody forgot to put something on an engine. All these little tiny stories that we get to hear every week, and wow, how lucky we are. So that is what makes up the Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida, where the sun always shines and running trains is an absolute pleasure.